Number 12. Liberator FP-45. The crate is smaller than a loaf of bread, but inside is a gun meant to start a war inside a war. In 1942, in Detroit, General Motors' Guide Lamp Division is stamping out the FP-45 Liberator in a room where speed matters more than pride. The thing is almost rude in its simplicity. A single-shot, smoothbore .45 ACP pistol, about 5 inches long, roughly a pound in the hand, a weapon that looks less like a sidearm than a stamped threat. It comes with 10 rounds, a wooden rod to punch out the spent case, and picture-only instructions so nobody has to speak a word to use it. The whole design is built around one brutal moment at arm's length. Press it into an enemy, fire once, take his better gun, and disappear into the chaos. The Joint Psychological Warfare Committee asked for it in 1942, and that detail tells you almost everything. This was never just about bullets. It was about fear. It was about making an occupation feel unstable, personal, unsafe. It was about dropping thousands of tiny metal promises into enemy territory and letting the idea of resistance spread faster than the weapons themselves. Even the name was camouflage. FP was meant to sound harmless. A flare projector, a flare pistol, something ordinary enough to slide past enemy intelligence without a second look. But there was nothing ordinary about what the gun was for. It was made to be seen, then used, then traded away. Picture the first crates being sealed in Detroit. Oil and stamped steel hang in the air. Workers keep their voices low and never quite say what they are making. The pistol has no real elegance. No long barrel, no magazine, no illusion of a fair fight. It was designed for a single distance, close enough to feel the other man breathe. That gave the weapon its own psychology in the hand. If you held it, you were not supposed to think like a marksman. You were supposed to think like an ambusher. That is what made it dangerous to the people who feared it, and useful to the people who wanted a weapon that could change hands in a second. Production moved with almost absurd speed, about 11 weeks. That is all it took to turn a secret committee request into 1 million weapons. 1 million. Not a careful batch, not a pilot program, a flood. The numbers are so large they stop sounding real, but the scale mattered because the plan depended on saturation. 1 pistol could be useless. 10,000 could be a rumor. 1 million could become a presence, something occupiers had to imagine behind every wall, every cart, every dark doorway. The logic was cold and simple. If the weapon is cheap enough, you can treat it like a match. Light it, throw it, move on. The war did not move on cue. The plan assumed the Liberator would fall into the hands of underground fighters across occupied Europe, where a single hidden shot could trigger a better one. Instead, the record gets muddy. Most of the millions seem to have gone somewhere else, to civilians in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, handed out in places where the battlefield was wider, stranger, and less tidy than the planners wanted. Some were likely airdropped. Some were distributed through channels that never made it into the clean version of the story. Some may have vanished before they ever reached a resistance cell. The paperwork thins out here. The neat wartime vision breaks apart. A weapon designed for sabotage starts drifting into the hands of people who were never part of the original fantasy. The Liberator does not look like a famous gun. It does not behave like one either. It is not accurate at distance. It is not powerful in the way a rifle is powerful. It is not even meant to stay with the person who fires it. It is a transfer device, a one-shot bridge between being helpless and being armed with something better. The steel itself is almost secondary to the idea stamped into it. Hold it in your palm, and you can see the whole philosophy in miniature. Survive one moment, seize the next one. In 1942, that idea was enough to justify secrecy, speed, and a factory line churning out weapons by the million. But when the crates were opened and the numbers were counted, the story became less tidy than the design. 1 million built, only a fraction clearly traced. Many lost, diverted, handed off, or destroyed. Which means the Liberator survives now less as a battlefield success than as proof of how desperate Allied planning had become. A pistol made to be cheap, silent in purpose, and impossible to ignore once you understood what it was for. After 1 million were made, most of them slipped out of the record. Number 11. Welrod pistol. A pistol built to disappear. In 1940, while Britain was still reeling from the collapse of Europe, the Special Operations Executive was formed and pushed into the kind of war that could not be fought in daylight. Its job was sabotage, subversion, resistance. Quiet work, the sort of work that leaves almost no trace. Near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, that brief became a weapon. Major Hugh Reeves led the design of a pistol meant for one purpose only: let an agent silence a sentry without warning an entire street. The Welrod was not designed like a handgun, it was designed like a problem. The barrel sat inside an integral suppressor. The magazine held 5 rounds in the grip. The action was bolt-operated, slow by ordinary standards, but perfect for a weapon that was supposed to be fired once, maybe twice, then vanished back into a coat or a satchel. No shine, no decoration, no extra markings that could tell the wrong person where it came from. In a war built on noise, this thing was built to leave none. Not a clean weapon, a controlled absence. That mattered because the men who carried it were not regular troops. They were agents, moving through occupied Europe, where a single shot could bring down a patrol or a whole house of consequences. One sentry on a dark lane, one pull of the bolt, one suppressed crack that never really becomes a sound. Then nothing. The target falls, the team moves, and the weapon itself tries to become invisible. That was the dream. The reality was more specific and stranger. The name came from the place where the work began, Welrod. Well from Welwyn, the Hertfordshire site tied to SOE research. Part of a broader naming system, a little bureaucratic camouflage for clandestine tools. Even the word sounds like it was trying to hide in plain sight. By the time wartime production settled in, Birmingham Small Arms was making examples for service use and for training, because secret weapons still need living hands on them before they ever reach the field. The dated museum example from 1944 is a .32 Mark II, and that detail matters. This was not a sketch on paper anymore. It was a standardized object, with a caliber, a pattern, and a place in the machinery of war. The caliber was .32, or 7.65 millimeters Browning short, though a 9 millimeter parabellum variant also existed. Those numbers look small next to the brute force of the war around it. That is the point. The Welrod was not supposed to dominate a battlefield. It was supposed to solve a very narrow human problem at very close range. If the job was to remove a guard, the weapon did not need drama. It needed reliability, discretion, and a way to make the shooter seem like he had never been there. The gun was an answer to the kind of question armies hate asking because the answer sounds too much like a secret. More than 2,800 were produced, which is enough to make the Welrod real, and still nowhere near enough to make its story simple. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force says it was airdropped to special forces and resistance fighters. Its own display example was used by the Danish resistance. The pistol stops being just a British design and becomes part of the hidden ecosystem of occupied Europe. Containers in the dark, packages on parachutes, weapons passed to people who might get one chance to use them, and none to be seen with them afterward. That is the strange life of a secret weapon. It is made in the factory, but it is judged in the shadows. The museum record also hints at a split that tells you a lot about how covert war really worked. Surviving examples without manufacturer markings were meant for special operations. At least one museum-held pistol is marked, and is described as probably a training piece. So some Welrods were meant to disappear into the field, while others lived a different life entirely, one of instruction, rehearsal, and controlled demonstration. The secret was not just in the design, it was in the distribution. Some pistols were for the mission, some were for the lesson. Imagine being the man assigned to carry it. You are not carrying a symbol. You are carrying a tool that only matters when everything else has gone wrong. The pistol is compact, but it is also deliberate in a way that feels almost surgical. That bolt has to be worked. The rounds have to feed. The suppressor has to do its job. Every part is a reminder that silence is not free. It is engineered. It is bought with complexity hidden inside the tube. The Welrod does not look like courage. It looks like restraint. There is a reason these weapons end up in archives. They are too specialized for ordinary memory. The world remembers tanks and fighters and rifles because they shout. The Welrod whispers, and because it whispers, it often slips out of the larger story. The last reported use in 1982 during the Falklands War sounds like an echo from another century. A weapon born in the secret offices of World War II, still surfacing decades later, still useful in the narrow spaces where silence matters more than range or power. That is not the life of a famous gun. That is the life of a hidden solution that refused to stay buried. The full operational count is missing. How many reached combat use in occupied Europe, and how many sat in training rooms, storage crates, or resistance caches, waiting for a hand that never came? The museums confirm production, airdrops, and some use, but not the full tally. That leaves the Welrod suspended between record and rumor, between issued tool and vanished asset. It was built for the kind of war that wanted no witnesses. The archive remembers the design, but not always the shot. For special operations only. Number 10. Lisle carbine. In 1942, William Godfrey de Lisle was not designing a loud new rifle for parade ground myths. He was working on something stranger, a weapon that could erase a century before the century ever understood the war had reached him. The first version was almost absurd in its simplicity. De Lisle started with a .22 rifle and used it on rabbits near his home, testing the basic idea of quiet killing before he ever moved to combat. That matters because the legend around this gun often makes it sound like some fully formed miracle pulled from a classified vault. It was not. It was a private proof of concept, then a hard military answer to a very specific problem. If a commando team had to slip past wire, past guards, past a checkpoint, they did not need volume. They needed one shot that disappeared into the night. So de Lisle built the combat carbine around a shortened Lee-Enfield action, a Mark III asterisk base, and a .45 ACP chambering. Not a rifle round, a pistol round. That choice looks small on paper, but it is the whole story. The .45 ACP is slow, heavy, and comparatively quiet when you are trying to push as little noise as possible through an integral suppressor. The action was familiar, the cartridge was blunt, and the suppressor was built in from the start, not an accessory. The machine's reason for existing. In the field, that combination meant something rare. You could fire the weapon, and the target might fall before the sound finished disappearing into the dark. British Special Operations personnel saw prototype guns demonstrated by 1943. By 1944, Sterling Armaments had received a production order. The machine was moving from experiment to issued asset. In reality, it was already trapped inside secrecy. Weapons like this do not become famous by being used in open battle. They become famous by being spoken about in fragments, in records, in the spaces between official lines. And the numbers are where the myth starts to crack. A wartime order of 500 is widely reported, but the total actually completed is usually given as about 129 or 130. Sometimes 129, sometimes 130. Sometimes just about 130, which is the kind of answer archivists give when the paper trail has been thinned by classification, dispersal, and time. That uncertainty is not a footnote. It is the fingerprint of the weapon's whole life. This was a covert affair. The exact count was messy because the job itself was messy. It was built for teams that did not leave neat records behind. That is why the de Lisle has such a strange reputation. People call it a suppressed rifle, but that undersells what it actually was. It was a hybrid. A Lee-Enfield heart grafted to a pistol cartridge and wrapped in silence. A bolt-action carbine that was less interested in range than in absence. No muzzle flash, very little report, no dramatic recoil. Just a shot, a body, and a guard post that never had time to raise an alarm. The British did not build it to win firefights. They built it to end them before they started. Picture the kind of operation it was made for. You are in the dark, close enough to hear boots on gravel, but far enough that a shouted warning would be fatal. The mission is not to storm the position. It is to remove the one man who can sound the alarm. So the weapon has to behave like a tool, not a symbol. It has to fire once, maybe twice, and leave the world almost exactly as it found it. That is the difference between a standard infantry arm and a secret weapon buried in wartime paperwork. One is meant to be seen. The other is meant to vanish after use. And vanishing is exactly what the Lisle did. It stayed rare, not just because production was limited, but because production itself was never the point. The war ended before the design could be made in large numbers, so the Lisle never became a mass answer to anything. It became a specialist answer, preserved in a narrow slice of history. The kind of weapon that shows up in archives, in museum records, in secondary histories, and then seems to fade again the moment you look away. That is where the later service history matters. Between 1948 and 1957, the Lisle appears again in the Malayan emergency. Years after World War II, the same silence still had a job to do. The gun outlived the war that birthed it, which tells you something important. This was not a gimmick from a desperate year. It was a working solution to an enduring problem. If you needed to kill quietly, there were still very few better answers. And yet the archive refuses to give up its mystery. One museum record lists a 1943 silenced carbine. Another points to the 1944 production order. The totals never settle cleanly. 129, 130, about 130. A weapon designed to erase sound now lives inside a record that cannot fully count it. That is fitting, in a way. The Lisle was built for secret hands, secret missions, and secret exits. It did not need a large footprint. It needed to exist at the moment a sentry stood alone, unaware of how close the dark had come. By the time the order went out in 1944, the carbine was already a quiet answer to a war that kept demanding louder and louder things. Somewhere in the files, that answer was reduced to a number, a contract, and a line item that should have disappeared with the rest. But it did not disappear. It waited. It sat in crates, in depots, in special operations stores, while the war moved on around it. Then one night, a hand reached for the short barrel. The bolt was eased forward, and the next shot never had to be heard at all. Number 9. Sten Mk II silenced submachine gun. In 1942, the National Army Museum's Sten Mk II was issued to British Special Forces, and the first thing you notice is not what was added, but what was rebuilt. The standard Sten was already a crude 9mm submachine gun, built for speed of production and nothing else. The silenced version had to do the opposite. It had to be quiet, controlled, and still simple enough to carry into occupied Europe. So the suppressor was made integral, not screwed on. The weapon grew longer, heavier at the front, more specialized from the start. A normal Sten could be stamped out fast, with a 32-round magazine and a shape that looked almost insultingly basic. The Mk II kept that same magazine system, but the barrel was now buried inside a silencing unit that changed the balance of the gun and the way it was used. This was not a battlefield spray weapon. According to the National Army Museum, automatic fire could damage the silencing system, so the gun was effectively meant for single shots except in an emergency. That is a strange sentence to attach to a submachine gun, because it turns the weapon inside out. It was built to fire fast, but it was trusted most when it did not. The whole design was a mechanical compromise between concealment and force. In covert war, that compromise was the point. You can see the problem in the numbers. A suppressed Sten Mk II is listed at 305 meters per second, or 1,001 feet per second. That matters because it keeps the round below the speed of sound. No sharp crack, no little sonic boom betraying the shot. The mechanical clack of the action, the muted impulse of the round, and the chance that the man across the room might not know what happened until he was already falling. Silence is never free. The same engineering that lowered the noise also made the weapon more fragile. the suppressor got hot. Hot enough that field use sometimes required a canvas cover around it for protection. So the silent gun that was supposed to solve a problem quietly still carried an awkward, practical burden. It looked improvised because, in a sense, it was. That was the logic of the SOE, created in July 1940 for sabotage, subversion, and clandestine action. Its agents did not need volume, they needed denial. They needed a shot that did not bring a patrol running down the street. They needed the first man to fall before anyone understood there had been a shot at all. The Sten Mk II fit that mission because it was not trying to win a firefight. It was trying to prevent one from starting. In occupied Europe, that distinction could decide whether an operation ended in seconds or in a cordon of Germans searching the dark with rifles and lanterns. In 1943, the suppressed Sten program enters service in clandestine operations, and that date matters because it marks the moment the gun leaves theory and enters the kind of work that never makes a clean report. British Special Forces received examples across the span from 1942 to 1955, but the wartime use is where the weapon earns its place in the archive. Not as a hero gun, not as a mass-issue arm, a specialist tool, a gun for agents, raiding parties, and moments when the cost of noise was higher than the cost of recoil. There is another layer buried in the paperwork. Captured German examples were catalogued as MP-751E. That is the sort of designation that sounds boring until you realize what it means. The weapon was secret, but not invisible. It crossed enemy lines. It was handled, seized, logged, and renamed by the other side. A gun made for concealment still left a bureaucratic footprint in German records. That is the recurring shape of secret war. The field wants silence. The archive wants a number. So the same weapon that was meant to vanish into a raid ends up surviving as a line in a museum catalog, a capture code, and a dated specimen from 1942. The Mark II-S was a silenced submachine gun, a controlled technical answer to covert warfare. In practice, it was something more awkward and more telling. A weapon so specialized that its best use came when it behaved less like a submachine gun and more like a patient, one-round instrument. It promised volume, but asked for restraint. It promised speed, but demanded discipline. The archive calls it a Sten. The field treated it like a secret that had to be handled gently, because the quiet part was the only reason it worked. Number 8. Browning High Power with Suppressor. A pistol that looked ordinary until you put a voice on it and heard how little it had to say. In 1944, William J. Donovan walked to the White House carrying a suppressed weapon to show Franklin Roosevelt what the OSS was building. That was not a hobbyist's gesture. It was the director of American intelligence bringing silence into the most public house in the country, because by then the war had taught a brutal lesson. Sometimes the best weapon was the one nobody heard. The Office of Strategic Services had been created on June 13, 1942, and almost immediately its research and development branch went hunting for tools that could make a shot disappear. Stanley Lovell, who ran that work, was not designing trophies. He was designing outcomes. If an operative had to take out a sentry, cross a courtyard, or leave a building before anyone understood what had happened, the gun had to buy time, not attention. So the OSS started pushing silenced firearms as a doctrine, not a curiosity. Look at the Browning High Power in that light, and the pistol stops being a sidearm and starts becoming a delivery system for denial. That matters because the high power already had the qualities covert work needed. It was a wartime service pistol with real capacity, usually 15 rounds in 9x19 millimeters, and enough reliability to be trusted when everything else was going wrong. It had been around since 1935, long enough to be known, long enough to be copied, long enough to earn a reputation that reached elite users on both sides of the Allied covert world. The British Special Air Service used it. The OSS had access to it. Suppressed pistol is only as useful as the pistol under the suppressor. A weak platform gives you noise, jams, and regret. A good one gives you a quiet first strike, and maybe a second, maybe a third, before the room understands it has changed shape. Picture the logic in one cold, practical scene. Night. A guard post at the edge of a rail yard or a depot. One sentry standing under a lamp, a few steps from the door that matters. An operative does not need a firefight. He needs the guard to stop existing as a problem. The suppressed high power is raised, the shot stays close to the body, and the sound is reduced enough to blur into the environment instead of exploding through it. No dramatic echo, no alarm bell, just a man dropping out of the night and a door that can now be opened without a chase. That is the whole point. Not heroics, not spectacle. The weapon is there so the mission can continue as if nothing happened. The archive suggests that this was not a fringe fantasy. It was being treated seriously enough that Donovan himself carried a silencer into the White House in 1944 to demonstrate the concept to Roosevelt. Think about the image for a second. The director of the OSS standing in front of the president with a device built to kill quietly, making the case that silence had become strategically valuable. That is a strange kind of theater, but it is also revealing. The suppressed weapon had already moved from workshop problem to political object. It was no longer just a gadget for a mechanic in a basement. It was something intelligence chiefs could place on a table in Washington and say, "This is the future of certain kinds of war." Browning had not built the high power for espionage. It was a conventional, high-capacity military pistol. But war has a habit of repurposing the ordinary into the secret. A sidearm made for officers and issue belts becomes, in the right hands, a tool for sentry removal, close-range assassination, and silent escape. The same 15-round magazine that made it attractive to regular soldiers also made it attractive to men who could not afford to reload under pressure. The same 9x19mm cartridge that made it a standard service weapon also made logistics easier for covert teams moving through Allied channels. Nothing in that list sounds glamorous. That is exactly why it worked. There is a deeper pattern here that shows up again and again in the archives of secret war. The loud weapons get the headlines. The buried weapons get the real assignments. A rocket is visible from miles away. A suppressed pistol exists to collapse distance without announcing itself. One of them changes the map. The other changes the room you are standing in. The Browning high power with the suppressor belonged to the second category, where success looked almost boring from the outside because the real action was the absence of sound. This weapon sits so well inside a chapter about hidden wartime tools because the high power was impressive, but that is not the point. The point is what it reveals about the men who wanted it paired with a silencer in the first place. They were building for situations where the shot was only the beginning, where the true objective was not impact, but delay, not destruction, but disappearance. A gun like that does its best work when nobody can tell it has already done its work. Years later, that is what survives in the record. Not a battlefield legend, not a glorious photograph, just a pistol tied to elite units, OSS experiments, a White House demonstration, and a hard wartime logic that treated quiet as a weapon in its own right. The high power did not need to be exotic to become dangerous. It only needed to be present, loaded, and fitted for a job where the sound of one shot could cost everything. In the archive, it is the kind of object that looks harmless until you notice how carefully it was meant to leave no trace. Number 7. Nambu Model 94 was a pistol so small it could vanish in a palm, but one exposed bar turned it into a legend. In 1944, an Imperial Japanese Army sidearm dated 19.6 was photographed in an archive, and at first it looks ordinary. Then your eye catches the left side of the frame. There it is, a thin external sear bar, sitting out in the open like someone forgot to finish the gun. That one detail is why the Type 94 Nambu became infamous. It also explains why the story people repeat about it is only half true. The photograph matters because it is not showing a battlefield. It is showing a mechanism. Mechanisms do not lie, but they do need context. The Type 94 entered production in 1935 because the Imperial Japanese Army wanted something smaller than the bulky Type 14 Nambu. Officers needed a sidearm that would sit easier on the hip. Tank crews needed something that would not snag in a cramped hatch. Aircrews needed a pistol that could be carried without dragging weight they did not have room for. The answer was an 8mm Nambu semi-automatic pistol that was shorter, lighter, and far more convenient than the weapon it replaced. On paper, that sounds like common sense, a practical war pistol for practical jobs. But the archive image shows the catch. The sear bar was visible on the outside of the frame, and if pressure hit it in exactly the wrong place, the pistol could discharge without the trigger being pulled. That is the part that made it infamous later, especially in post-war retellings. The surrender pistol label came from that reputation, as if the gun itself had been designed by accident and fear. The real record is messier. Dangerous feature can be real and still be misunderstood. You can see that tension in the surviving examples. Early pistols are cleaner, the machining is better, the finish is more consistent. The wooden grips fit like a deliberate choice. But by the time the war is going badly, the same design starts coming out rougher, cruder, and more desperate. The grip panels shift from Bakelite to wood around 19.7, and even that small change says a lot. It is not just a material swap, it is a symptom. Japan's industrial situation was collapsing, and the pistol began to show it in every uneven edge. The archive is useful because it gives you a weapon and then forces you to ask what you are actually looking at. Is this a bad design, or a decent design pushed through terrible conditions? The answer from later breakdowns, including Ian McCollum's 2020 analysis for forgotten weapons, is that the Type 94 was not merely a reckless mistake. It was also genuinely more convenient for certain users than the Type 14. Smaller, easier to carry, better suited to cramped positions where a full-size sidearm became a nuisance. Some Japanese officers preferred it for exactly that reason. That does not erase the flaw, it only makes the flaw more interesting. The exposed sear bar was not hidden. It was not a secret defect buried in the guts of the pistol. It sat there in plain sight, a mechanical oddity that could be touched, pressed, and blamed. Once wartime production started slipping, tolerance problems and rough finishing made everything worse. A feature that was already questionable became far less forgiving when factory quality began to break down. The gun did not have to be cursed, it only had to be built under pressure. The numbers make that pressure visible. Production began in 1935 and kept going until 1945. Roughly 70,000 to 71,000 pistols were made in total. That is not a giant wartime run by global standards, but it is enough to leave a trail across the archives, enough for collectors, historians, and restorers to compare one marking against another and see the decline. A pistol dated 19.6 is June 1944, not some random calendar stamp. It is a reign year marking, tied to the Showa era, and once you understand that system, the artifacts stop being anonymous. They become time capsules. The Type 94 is not just remembered as unsafe, it is remembered as strange. That exposed bar looks like a design mistake to modern eyes, but wartime Japan was full of compromises that made perfect sense to the men using them. A pistol did not need to be elegant. It needed to be carried. It needed to fit a uniform, a seat, a cockpit, a narrow steel interior with not enough space for anything generous. In that world, smaller could mean more useful. Not safer, more useful. The archive photo is doing two jobs at once. It shows the real hazard. It shows the reason the pistol kept existing anyway. That is the part people forget when they only repeat the legend. The Type 94 was not feared because it was useless. It was feared because it was useful enough to keep in service even when everyone knew the risk. That is the kind of weapon wartime archives love to preserve. Not the one that looks powerful, but the one that kept getting chosen despite the danger, until the last rough examples finally came off the line in 1945, with the war itself already collapsing around them. Number 6. Type 99 Arisaka. Late 1939, Japan is already rethinking the rifle that carried it into war. In the arsenals, the old 6.5mm round is starting to look thin. Enemy rifles are hitting harder. Machine guns are throwing heavier cartridges. The Imperial Japanese Army reaches for a replacement, and the answer is the Type 99 Arisaka. A bolt-action rifle built around the 7.7 by 58 mm cartridge. Put into production in 1939, still simple enough to trust in mud, cold, and salt air, different enough to show that Japan knew the battlefield had changed. On paper, the Type 99 is a practical upgrade. 5 rounds in the internal magazine, an effective range listed at 440 meters, about 481 yards. A 2.5 times telescopic sight for sniping. A rifle that looks like it should fit neatly into the same family as everything else in the war. Then you notice the details. The folding monopod, the rear sight wings. Not decoration, not vanity. A real answer to a real fear. Low, fast aircraft coming in close over the islands, so close that a soldier might actually try to track them with a rifle meant for the ground. That tells you a lot about Japanese combat thinking in the Pacific. The war was not happening in some clean line on a map. It was happening on beaches, ridges, airstrips, and jungle edges where everything could turn vertical in a second. A rifle like this was trying to do more than one job, because the men carrying it were often expected to do more than one job. You were not just shooting at a man in front of you. You were watching the sky. You were watching the tree line. You were waiting for a landing craft, a strafing run, or a charge through the smoke. Type 99 was supposed to help replace the older Type 38. That was the plan. A cleaner, heavier, more modern service rifle. Wartime plans are one thing, wartime supply is another. In the field, the switch never fully happened. The Type 38 kept hanging on. The Type 99 spread, but not cleanly, not everywhere, not fast enough to wipe the old rifle away. By the time American troops were fighting Japanese units on islands like Attu, they were finding brand new Type 99s still sitting in their packing crates. Crates. Untouched. Waiting. Think about what that means. Japan was manufacturing rifles that had already lost the race to reach the men who needed them. The tension inside this weapon is not whether it was good. It was. Not whether it was modern. It was. The problem was scale, timing, and the brutal math of a shrinking empire trying to arm too many fronts at once. A rifle in a crate is useless. A rifle in a soldier's hands can change a hill. If the crates are still sealed while the fighting is already on top of you, the issue is no longer design. It is throughput. It is shipping. It is the invisible war behind the war. When Japan's industrial position began to collapse, the rifle changed with it. The late-war Type 99s got rougher, simpler, faster to make. The fit and finish dropped away. The careful engineering gave way to emergency production. Sharp edges stayed sharp. Small luxuries disappeared. The rifle stopped looking like a polished answer and started looking like a last attempt to keep the line moving. Same basic weapon, but now it was being asked to survive the factory floor as much as the battlefield. To hold one of the better examples today, the numbers still tell the story. About 112 centimeters overall, a 63.5 centimeter barrel, long enough to feel deliberate, compact enough to move through brush and wreckage. It was a weapon built for a war where distances collapsed fast, where a soldier might need to fire from a trench lip 1 minute and swing toward the sky the next. That is why the anti-aircraft wings matter. That is why the sniper provision matters. That is why the rifle looks, at first glance, like a compromise between competing demands. Because it was. The deeper story is not in the steel. It is in the delay. The Type 99 should have become Japan's standard service rifle. Instead, it became one more example of a wartime weapon that arrived with the right answer and too little time. The archives keep showing that pattern. A design appears. It solves a real problem. Then the war outruns the factories, outruns the shipping, outruns the men who were supposed to carry it. By the end, the weapon still exists, but the system around it is breaking apart. That is where the interesting part begins, because the rifle was not buried by failure. It was buried by the speed of a war that kept moving faster than Japan could replace what it had already lost. One American report from Attu put it bluntly. Brand new rifles, still crated, still waiting. New rifles, unopened crates. Number 5. FG-42. A rifle built for men who were never meant to carry rifles this way. In 1942, in German offices and training grounds, the Luftwaffe laid down a brutal requirement. Paratroopers had to jump light, but when they hit the ground, they still needed to fight like infantry. No heavy rifle in one hand, no separate machine gun team behind them. One weapon had to do both jobs. That order, written in the language of doctrine, became the FG-42. By the time the first prototypes were ready, the shape alone told you how strange this thing was. It sat at about 37 inches overall, short enough to handle in a landing zone, but it still fired the full-power 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser round. Not a pistol cartridge, not a cut-down compromise, a real rifle round, the kind that kicked hard enough to punish a careless shoulder. The magazine sat under the receiver in a 20-round box, and the action was built for selective fire. Semi-automatic when you wanted reach. Automatic when the fight collapsed into a few meters of mud, smoke, and shouting. At Heinrich Krieghoff Waffenfabrik in Suhl, the early production guns came together under wartime pressure, and every detail carried the same argument. Light frame, full-power cartridge, compact length, high cyclic rate, around 750 to 800 rounds per minute if you let it run. On paper, that sounds almost impossible. In the hand, it was worse. Or better, depending on who was holding it. A man carrying one of these into a jump did not carry a normal rifle. He carried the idea that one paratrooper should land ready to replace a rifleman, a light machine gunner, and part of a close defense team all at once. That was the whole pitch. A new infantry rifle, a doctrine weapon. A gun built around the airborne problem, where the enemy could be waiting at the drop zone and the seconds after landing mattered more than the hours before it. The first real test came in September 1943 during the Gran Sasso raid. Benito Mussolini was being held high in the mountains, and German commandos moved in to pull him out. The scene was all altitude, urgency, and thin air. Men in motion, gliders, gunfire waiting at the edge of a rescue that had to work the first time. Among the weapons in play was the FG-42, and that is where the rifle stopped being a drawing and became a problem with recoil. You can picture the shooter wrapping his hand around the grip, shouldering the weapon, and feeling how little there is between him and the cartridge. There is no heavy timber stock to soak up the blow. There is no comfort in the design. The rifle stays short and light because the parachute demand required it. But the 7.92 by 57 mm round does not care about doctrine. It slams the bolt, shoves the frame, and pushes the muzzle up as soon as the trigger is held back. On semi-auto, the gun is manageable enough. On automatic, it becomes something else entirely. A burst is not a long stream of fire, it is a negotiation. The men who encountered it admired it and feared it for the same reason. It could reach farther than the submachine guns that filled so many close-quarters battles. It could answer in the open. It could also turn into a handful of violent recoil if the shooter was not disciplined. The weapon solved one problem and created another in the same motion. The Germans wanted one soldier to do 3 jobs. The rifle kept reminding them that physics still had a vote. The battlefield use stayed rare. The gun was not built for mass issue in the way the Sten was built for mass issue, or the way a standard bolt-action rifle could be stamped out in overwhelming numbers. It was harder than that, more delicate, more specific. It belonged to the narrow world of airborne troops, where every kilogram mattered and every second after landing mattered more. By the end of the war, only about 7,000 had been made. A small number, but enough to leave a trace that would not disappear. The men who handled it knew what they had. A compact rifle with a detachable 20-round magazine. A weapon that could, at least in theory, stand in for several others. A gun that looked like the future and felt like punishment. If you were dropped behind enemy lines with one, you understood the bargain immediately. You got reach, you got flexibility. You got a machine that could answer hard questions in a hurry. But you also got the kick, the rise, the struggle to keep it under control when the fire changed from aimed shots to frantic bursts. That made it hard to copy neatly and easy for later history to simplify into a legend. People like clean descendants, They like a line that runs from one gun to the next, from one idea to the next, as if the archive were a straight road. But the record is messier. The FG-42 was not the beginning of everything, and it was not the end of anything either. It was a very specific answer to a very specific airborne nightmare, built in 1942, blooded in September 1943, and left behind with only a few thousand examples to show for the effort. The smoke clears, the thing you are left holding is not a universal rifle. It is a weapon that worked best exactly where it was hardest to live with, and the archive kept it, quietly, in the corner of the war's unfinished files. Number 4. STG-44. In the winter of 1944, an American soldier in the Ardennes picked up a German rifle that looked like it had arrived from the future, only with the wrong name stamped on it. The STG-44 did not begin as the STG-44. It began as the Maschinenkarabiner 42H, a stamped steel rifle from Henel, sent to the front in November 1942 and judged in the coldest way possible, by whether men under fire kept reaching for it again. They did. By March 1943, the Army had already accepted 2,734 of them. In April, another 2,179. In May, 3,044 more. By the upper estimates, as many as 12,000 had moved through the system while the design kept changing under combat pressure. That is how a weapon becomes real in wartime, not in a showroom, in mud, in panic, in hands that have no patience for theory. The man at the center of that story was not Hitler and not some faceless engineer in a Berlin office. It was Hugo Schmeisser, the designer whose name would become attached to the rifle's shadow as much as its steel. In the German weapons bureaucracy, names mattered almost as much as performance. So the rifle was disguised first as an MP, then, late in 1944, promoted into a new category, Sturmgewehr 44, assault rifle. The label sounded like doctrine, but it was also camouflage. If you called it a machine pistol, you could smuggle the idea past resistance. If you called it an assault weapon, you admitted that infantry combat was changing in front of everyone's eyes. Schmeisser lived inside that contradiction. He was helping build a weapon the system did not fully want to name, even while the front was already proving what it could do. The rifle itself was built around a simple insult to old assumptions. Not a full-power rifle round, not a pistol cartridge, a 7.92 by 33 mm Coors, with a 33 mm case and a 48 mm overall length, designed to split the difference between range and control. That mattered because the old battlefield categories were failing. A rifle that was accurate but brutal to fire in bursts. A submachine gun that was easy to handle but short-legged. The STG-44 tried to live in the middle. It offered controllable automatic fire and a practical, effective range around 300 meters. It was made for the distances where most infantry fights actually happened, not the heroic distances old doctrine preferred to imagine. You can see why that made bureaucrats nervous. A weapon like this was not just a new gun, it was a quiet accusation. If it worked, then the Army had spent years preparing men for the wrong kind of war. So the paperwork had to lie a little. The rifle's real nature was buried under the label first, and then buried deeper under production language, because the design family itself was messy. The MKB-42H and the late-war STG-44 were not separate miracles. They were stages of the same line, the same idea being forced through the grind of combat and administration at the same time. The archive preserves that struggle so clearly, not a clean invention, but a fight over what a weapon was allowed to be called. Schmeisser never got the luxury of a clean victory story. By the time the rifle reached the Eastern Front in meaningful numbers, the war had already begun to collapse around Germany. American troops first encountered it during the Ardennes fighting in December 1944. They were seeing something that arrived too late to change the outcome. Too late for Germany, not too late to change the argument. The rifle's presence said the future of infantry firepower had already shown up in the snow, even if the Reich was too broken to benefit from it. That is the cruel timing of military innovation. A good idea can be buried inside a losing cause. Schmeisser's work sat inside that loss. He was not just shaping a mechanism, he was helping answer a question Germany had been postponing for years. What kind of rifle does a modern soldier actually need? The answer was shorter, lighter, more flexible, and far less reverent toward old distinctions. You can almost feel the doctrine breaking apart around it. The rifle was meant to reach out to 300 meters, but it was also meant to stay under control when a man had to fire fast and move faster. It did not ask the soldier to choose between a rifle and a submachine gun. It collapsed the categories into one object and dared the army to adjust. That is why the STG-44 matters beyond the steel and the cartridge. It was not only a battlefield tool, it was a bureaucratic confession. Germany had found a weapon that worked, but it had to rename it before it could admit what it was. Officially, it was an MP, then an assault rifle. In practice, it was the first clear proof that infantry firepower was leaving the old world behind. And the man who helped bring it into being had to watch that truth arrive under a false label. As if the future itself needed papers to get through the checkpoint. Number 3. Panzerfaust. Summer 1943, Germany, and a weapon so plain it looked like a factory mistake. A cardboard-like tube, a hollow shaft, a warhead on the end. No elegant mechanism exposed for a soldier to admire, no moving parts to worship. Just a disposable launcher built to be cheap, simple, and brutal. That was the point. German engineers were not trying to invent a beautiful weapon. They were trying to make a tank fear a man in a cellar. By August 1943, the first Faustpatrone and Panzerfaust 30 Klein were reaching units. The early order was for 20,000 weapons, but Hassag had only managed the first 500 deliveries that month. That mismatch tells you everything about the weapon's logic. It was not supposed to be rare. It was supposed to spread fast. Cheap enough to hand out. Deadly enough that a single infantryman could threaten Allied armor at point-blank range. The evidence points to something colder than the wonder weapon myth. It was built for a battlefield that had already shrunk. Start with the shaped charge. The Panzerfaust did not need speed in the way a gun needs it. It needed proximity. Inside that warhead sat an explosive shaped to focus its energy forward into a metal jet, punching through armor instead of smashing against it. That meant the launcher itself could be almost comically simple. A smooth tube, a propellant charge, a sight. Fire once, then throw the tube away. The soldier was not carrying a precision instrument. He was carrying a disposable decision. And because the launcher was single-use, Germany could mass issue it without asking a frontline unit to preserve it, maintain it, or bring it back. One man, one shot, one tank. That was the deal. The first Panzerfaust 30 was named for its effective range of about 30 meters. 30 meters is not a long shot. 30 meters is a hedge, a doorway, the end of a ruined street. It is the distance at which a tank is no longer a distant machine, but a shape moving through your world. By 1944, that mattered more than armor thickness. Allied tanks were still powerful, but they were also fighting through Normandy's bocage, through villages, orchards, rubble, and narrow roads that denied long-range gunnery. The Panzerfaust was not designed to win a tank battle in the open. It was designed to kill the idea of the open. You can see the logic in Normandy. British troops met the weapon in hedgerows and collapsed streets, where a hidden gunner could wait until a tank came close enough for the warhead to do its work. Imperial War Museums notes that the Panzerfaust was used to great effect there, and British troops even posed with captured examples after the fighting. That image matters because it shows both sides of the story at once. The weapon was feared enough to be worth collecting, but not so omnipotent that it rewrote every battle by itself. In Normandy, only about 6% of British tank losses were attributed to Panzerfaust fire. That is the part the legend usually leaves out. The weapon's reputation was bigger than its raw count in some campaigns. But reputation is also a weapon. If a tank crew believes every cellar contains a killer, they start driving differently. They start slowing down. They start waiting. And waiting is exactly what the Panzerfaust wanted. Germany understood that, and so the design kept evolving. September 1944, the Panzerfaust 60 appeared with an effective range of about 60 meters. That sounds like a small change on paper. In combat, it doubled the envelope in which an infantryman could spring the trap. Later came the Panzerfaust 100, reaching about 100 meters, which pushed the ambush outward just enough to make it more flexible in broken terrain. Still simple, still disposable, still cheap enough for mass issue. But now the weapon could wait a little farther back from the target, which meant better concealment, less exposure, and a slightly wider margin for the man carrying it. And by late war, Germany was producing them in staggering numbers. About 8 million Panzerfausts in the final 2 years. That number does not describe a prototype. It describes a system, a country under pressure, turning out millions of identical tubes because it had fewer ways left to stop enemy armor than it had villages left to defend. The Panzerfaust became a weapon of the last line. Not because it was elegant, because it was available. That is why the open question around it matters. Did the Panzerfaust destroy more tanks than the records show? Or did fear inflate its legend beyond the damage it actually caused in a campaign like Normandy? The answer is probably both. A weapon does not need to dominate every engagement to change how armies move. It only needs to force caution. It only needs to turn a road into a gamble. It only needs to make a hedgerow feel alive. So the story of the Panzerfaust is not that it killed armor from far away. It is that it made distance disappear. The tank could no longer assume safety because its enemy was just infantry. The battlefield had collapsed to the length of a few steps, and inside that tiny space, a hidden soldier with a single-use tube could decide everything. Not a duel, not a fair fight. Just a flash in the rubble, a plume of smoke, and a tank commander suddenly realizing the wall beside him was never a wall at all. Number 2. V1 Flying Bomb. The weapon that sounded like a machine gun in the sky. On June 13, 1944, the first V1 flying bombs came down on London, only days after D-Day had cracked open the Western Front. This was not a pilotless airplane in the modern sense. It was a winged bomb, launched from ramps in occupied France, driven by a pulse jet engine, carrying a 2,000-pound warhead, and meant to do one thing above all else: make a city feel helpless. The first people to hear it did not see anything at all. They heard the buzz first, a harsh mechanical drone cut across rooftops and streets, so distinctive that it became part of the weapon itself. Then the sound changed. If the engine stopped, the bomb had about 10 seconds left. Silence was not relief. Silence was the warning. Somewhere above London, a flying bomb had just entered its final dive. That detail mattered because it turned waiting into terror. You were not only listening for impact. You were listening for the moment the sky went quiet. By the end of the campaign, more than 10,000 of these weapons had been launched against Britain from mid-1944, and nearly 6,000 people were killed there alone. Overall, roughly 20,000 V1s were fired at Allied targets, and the human toll climbed past 10,000 civilians dead, with nearly 28,000 injured. Those numbers are large enough to blur into a statistic, but the weapon was designed to make each hit feel personal. It did not need a pilot. It did not need to miss by much. It only needed to land somewhere that people lived. A crude machine can become a strategic instrument that way, not by precision, by repetition. The strange thing is that the V1 was not a late improvisation from a collapsing regime. Its concept had been worked out as early as 1935, years before the air war over Britain reached its darkest phase. German engineers and planners had already imagined a future in which a bomb could fly itself. By 1944, desperation had simply given that idea a target. The V1 was both more and less advanced than the legend around it suggests. It was not a guided missile in the modern sense. It had no seeking mind, no way to correct itself once launched. It was launched, pointed, and let go. About 150 miles of range was enough to reach London from the continent, but not enough to change the basic fact that it was still a blunt instrument. The warhead was huge, the propulsion simple, the guidance primitive. It was mass production wearing the mask of genius. So many wonder weapons in World War II are misleading for that reason. They looked futuristic because they were terrifying, but terror is not the same thing as effectiveness. The British response came fast because it had to. Fighters scrambled, anti-aircraft guns shifted. Deception measures spread under Operation Crossbow. Every branch of defense had to learn the same ugly lesson. A weapon that is cheap, fast to build, and psychologically loud can force a nation to spend much more than it cost to make. You can see the arithmetic in the sky. A single V1 was one thing. A wave of them meant radar operators, fighter pilots, gunners, observers, and civilians all being pulled into the same contest. The attack was not just physical, it was administrative. It made England build a defense machine around a machine. V1's cruelty was not limited to the people under it. The weapons production depended on the tunnels at Mittelbau-Dora, where tens of thousands of slave laborers died building the underground facilities for V-weapons. So even before a flying bomb crossed the channel, the cost had already been paid in bodies buried under concrete and rock. That is the part of secret weapon mythology that gets hidden most often. The bomb did not come from nowhere. It came from a system that consumed labor, stripped away choice, and treated human life as a resource to be spent. You can hear the logic of the weapon in the name, vengeance. The Germans called it a vengeance weapon, as if destruction itself could substitute for strategy. But revenge does not change the outcome of a war. It only changes the shape of the suffering. The V1 hit cities, not armies. It was meant to break morale after D-Day had shifted the balance in Western Europe, to punish civilians for the fact that Germany was losing ground. The weapon matters in the larger story of World War II archives because it shows a regime reaching for technology not because it had found victory, but because victory was slipping away. The paradox sits inside the statistics. A weapon can be mass-produced, technically clever, and still fail at the thing its makers wanted most. The V1 killed, injured, and terrified. It forced Britain to adapt. It filled the air with a sound people never forgot. But it did not reverse the war. It could not. It was born too late, too crude, and too tied to a collapsing system that needed terror because it no longer had superiority. When the first V1s reached London on June 13, 1944, they were not just exploding bombs. They were proof that the most feared weapons are often the ones built when a state has run out of better answers. The story does not end with the blast. It ends with the silence after the buzz. In that silence, people learned what the weapon really was. Not a miracle, not a breakthrough, just a 2,000-pound warhead with about 10 seconds left. Number 1. V2 rocket. 10 seconds to live, and the people in London still could not touch it. On October 3, 1942, at Peenemünde on Germany's Baltic coast, Wernher von Braun's team watched the A4 rocket leave the pad cleanly for the first time. That single flight became the V2, the first large-scale liquid propellant rocket, the first modern long-range ballistic missile, and the prototype for a weapon that could cross roughly 200 miles at a speed of 3,500 to 4,000 miles per hour. For anyone on the ground, that meant something brutal and simple. If it was already coming down, interception was already over. Imagine that is not a test range, but your city. On September 6, 1944, the first operational V2s struck Paris. 2 days later, London was hit. No siren could outrun it, no fighter could catch it, no gun crew could see it coming in time to matter. The missile climbed into the edge of space, then fell back on a ballistic arc with about a 1-ton warhead inside the nose cone. When it arrived without warning. The V1 was terrifying because people could hear it. The V2 was worse because silence came first. You were standing on a street, in a shelter, in a kitchen, and then the building simply ceased to have a roof. That was the cold logic of the weapon, not just destruction, but interruption. This is why the V2 belongs at the peak of this story. It was not built to win tactically in the way generals usually mean. It was built to prove a point at the most expensive level possible. Germany's leadership wanted a terror weapon, a machine that could keep the war feeling dangerous even as the front collapsed. The engineers wanted something else entirely. They were testing a rocket that did what rockets had only done in theory: leave the atmosphere and come back under guidance. That distinction mattered because the same physics that delivered explosives to London would later deliver satellites, probes, and astronauts beyond Earth. One object, two futures. But the war did not care about the elegance of the engineering. It cared about numbers, and the numbers are ugly. Around 3,000 V2s were launched in wartime service. Each one cost staggering resources. Each one demanded precision manufacturing, fuel, transport, and secrecy. And still, the missile was too inaccurate to be a decisive military instrument. It could devastate a block, a depot, a street, but it could not reliably destroy the thing Germany actually needed to destroy. It was impossible to intercept, yes. It was also impossible to aim with the kind of control that would have made the effort worth it. So the weapon lived in the gap between terror and effectiveness, which is often where the most dangerous ideas survive longest. The horror was not just in the explosions. It was in the system that made them possible. After Peenemünde was attacked, production moved underground, and that move bound the rocket more tightly to forced labor, starvation, and death. The assembly sites were not clean engineering miracles. They were camps and tunnels and brutal shifts under the earth where prisoners built the future under conditions that killed more people than many of the rockets did. You cannot separate the V2 from Mittelbau-Dora any more than you can separate a blade from the hand that swung it. So when people later looked at the surviving missiles, they were not looking at one meaning. They were looking at a fight over memory. The Smithsonian's collection history shows exactly that tension. In later museum framing, the V2 was often presented as an aerospace landmark, repainted and displayed as a milestone on the road to space. And that was true. It was also a sanitized truth. The object did not arrive in history as a neutral artifact of science. It arrived as a Nazi weapon, built with slave labor, launched at civilians, and then inherited by the Americans and Soviets because both superpowers understood what its technology could become. That is the cold twist at the center of it. The V2 was not only a weapon buried in archives, it was a weapon that escaped the archive by changing categories. In wartime, it was terror. After the war, it became a template. Post-war missile programs studied it. Space launch systems learned from it. The same architecture that sent death down onto London became part of the machinery that sent humans upward. Because of that, the V2 is one of the hardest objects in the entire war to classify honestly. It was a battlefield paradox and a historical theft, a triumph of propulsion and a monument to what that triumph was used for. If you were standing in London in 1944, none of that would have felt abstract. It would have felt like a wall of air and dust arriving with no warning at all. That is the part the archive keeps returning to. Not the elegance, not the engineers. The moment after the impact, when people tried to understand what could possibly have hit them so hard and so fast. Documents preserve that stunned tone because even then, the scale was hard to absorb. As one wartime observer put it, "It came down without warning."